Why do people hate God and by association, God's people? One woman reacted to my podcast last week with this comment. Why don't you ask God how much child abuse is enough? And what about all the pregnant women and their unborn children who died in the great flood, which God initiated? Have you ever heard comments like that? Actually, I should probably ask, how often do you hear comments like that? You see, most people hate or reject God because he doesn't act the way they think he should. I mean, what good is an all powerful God if he doesn't prevent famine, floods, and child abuse? What good is a God that doesn't protect you and make you happy? Do they have a point? If you know someone who hates God or is disappointed in God or simply wants nothing to do with God, I'm willing to bet it's because they miss the most important thing about God. And I think you'll be surprised by what it is. This is Brad Bright. Welcome to the God is the Issue podcast, where I show how God is the issue in every issue. Today, I'm going to talk about God's central attribute. To state it another way, what characteristic lies at the core of God's being? Now, if you get this one wrong, you don't fully understand who God is, and therefore you will never be able to fully trust him. And of course, if you don't fully trust God, the Christian life will never work for you, at least not the way God intended. What would you say is the most important characteristic of God? His love, his justice, his holiness, or maybe his power? Many Americans, both Christians and non-Christians alike, would say it is his love. John 4:16 says, God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. Everyone wants God to be loving. But when something really bad happens, folks often decide God isn't very loving after all. In other words, his love is imperfect. It's flawed, just like ours. But Christian theologians repeatedly point out that God's central attribute is his holiness, not his love. My dad, Bill Bright, said, of all of God's attributes, nothing compares to the splendor and beauty of his holiness. It is chief among his attributes. Folks, that means his character is perfect in every way. He is totally pure. God's holiness is chief among his attributes. Does that surprise you? God's holiness is his core attribute, and there's a very good reason why. In Isaiah chapter 6, the angels in the throne room of heaven do not cry out, love, love, love is the Lord Almighty. No. They cry out, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. Are you wondering why love is not his core attribute? Wouldn't it feel better if it were? Actually, it wouldn't. His holiness is the reason we can be confident of God's unwavering love, mercy, and faithfulness. It's the reason we can confidently count on his power, justice, and truth. It's the reason the Christian life can be full and meaningful, regardless of our circumstances. Usually we think about God's holiness as being a bit scary, maybe even a bit harsh. But that's only half the picture. Let's look at the whole picture today. For anyone who reads their Bible much, we often hear God is holy. And when we do, we often think of Isaiah's vision of God seated on his throne in Isaiah chapter 6, which I mentioned just a moment ago. Or we may think of God expelling Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden because of their sin, which violated God's standard of holiness. Or even when God struck down Ananias and Sapphira for lying to Peter and the church leaders. See, all those things make God's holiness seem downright scary. You see, most people view God's holiness through the lens of his wrath towards sin, but they miss the part of his holiness that gives great comfort, security, and peace. It's critical to recognize both sides of God's holiness. That is, if we want to present him to a fallen world in a way that encourages them to love him rather than to hate him. You see, his holiness is the glue. It's the glue that binds all his other attributes together, including his love. You see, if God were not holy, you could not trust his love. God's holiness is his perfection. God's holiness makes all his other attributes perfect, including his love. So let's talk about why we want God to be holy. Let's talk about the side of his holiness that gives us comfort, security, and peace. But before we do, let me ask you, what does it even mean when we say God is holy? How would you answer that question? Now, theologians would tell you that it means God is set apart. It means he's in a category all of his own, as if we didn't already know that. But it means so much more. You know, when my wife Kathy teaches children about God's holiness, she says he is perfectly perfect. He is perfectly pure. That's what sets him apart. Now, since children are very concrete thinkers, she illustrates God's holiness with a glass of crystal clear water. She holds up the glass and tells them that this represents God's holiness. Then she drops a tiny, tiny piece of dog poop into the glass and asks if anyone wants to drink it. Of course, a lot of the fifth grade boys jump up waving their hands, because their brains haven't fully developed yet. But of course, it's not really dog poop, it's mud, but the kids don't know that. But she uses that as an illustration of what even a little bit of sin would do to God's purity, his perfection, his holiness. One little piece of dog poop makes crystal clear water undrinkable. One little piece of sin would completely profane God's holiness. That's a side of God's holiness that causes us to pause and step back. The part that makes us realize that we really do need Jesus. But today, let's look at God's holiness from the opposite direction. See, because God is holy, his love is perfect, his power is perfect, his justice is perfect, his knowledge is perfect, and his mercy is perfect. And that's because when we say God is holy, we mean he is perfectly perfect in every way. But what if God were ever so slightly imperfect? If he were not really perfectly perfect, but rather almost perfect? What if he were only 99.999% holy? Have you ever thought about that? What would be the implications for you? If his justice wasn't perfectly perfect, could you trust it? How do you know God would judge you fairly? Sure, Jesus died in your place, but if God's justice isn't perfectly perfect, there are no guarantees, are there? You need only look at our current judicial system to understand the disturbing implications. Or what if God's love wasn't perfectly perfect? Maybe he has a bad day once every 10 years. Are you willing to roll the dice on that? Now, those are great odds. But if you lose, then God squashes you like an ant or hangs you by your feet out over a precipice. If you're a follower of Jesus over the next few weeks, I encourage you to go through every attribute of God that you can think of and ask the question, if this part of God's character is only 99.999% holy, if this attribute of God is not perfectly perfect, what might be the implications for my future? It'll give you a much deeper appreciation for his holiness. When we view God's holiness separately from all his other attributes, we can sometimes wish that God weren't quite so holy. But when we view it in the context of his justice, his love, his mercy, and his power, we suddenly want God to be holy, to be perfectly pure. You see, because God's justice is holy, is perfectly perfect. We know that we can trust in the death of Christ to wipe our ledger completely clean in God's eyes. God's not going to wake up one day on the wrong side of the bed and arbitrarily say, off with his head. Because God's love is perfectly perfect, we know that nothing can ever separate us from his love. Romans 8 does not say almost nothing can separate us from his love. Romans 8 says nothing can separate us from his love. That's the difference between perfectly perfect love and almost perfect love. God is not going to have a bad day and say, oops, on the day you need his love the most. And because God's mercy is perfectly perfect, we know that he will always forgive us if we sincerely ask forgiveness in the name of Jesus, who paid the penalty for us. But folks, keep in mind that God will never compromise his holiness in order to make us feel good about ourselves today. He will never water down his purity by excusing our bad choices. God is perfectly loving, but he is not tolerant. There's a huge difference. It's like the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. He forgives, but he never excuses. He gives us free will. We're not puppets on a string. I've never met anyone who wants to be a puppet. See, God gives us the ability to choose the good or the bad, just like Adam and Eve. Now, the downside of free will is that we often experience the negative consequences of our bad choices. But that's not God's fault. It's mine. It's yours. See, all of God's attributes work together perfectly because of his holiness. You and I can't fully comprehend it because we're finite, but we can take great comfort in the fact that God is perfectly perfect. So the next time you think of God's holiness, that is his perfect purity, yes, you should be sobered by it, like Isaiah was as he stood there in front of God's throne with the angels crying, "Holy, holy, holy." But it should also make you feel incredibly grateful and secure. Our God is holy. Therefore, we can completely trust him every moment of every day. Because he is perfectly perfect, we can trust his justice, his love, his mercy, and his power in an angry world that cries out, "Do unto others as they have done unto you." In a cancel culture that lusts after retribution, God's holiness assures us of reconciliation with him. God is the issue in every issue. And God's holiness, his perfect perfection, is the glue that holds the entire universe together. This is Brad Bright. Thanks for joining me today. And if you found this podcast helpful, please like and subscribe. And remember, when subscribing, don't forget to click on the bell so you'll be notified whenever I publish a new podcast. God bless. And now go teach your children and grandchildren why you are grateful that God is holy.